Today we celebrate the Feast of the Holy Family, which is typically associated with this really famous gospel that you find in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2, the finding of the child Jesus in the temple. Pretty simple story, pretty straightforward. There is Jesus, he's still a young boy, and he's lost in the city of Jerusalem. And Mary and Joseph, they're searching for him frantically. And finally, when they discover the child Jesus, they discover him in the Jerusalem temple, teaching and otherwise conversing with the elders. And Mary speaks to the Lord. And so basically she expresses her anxiety, she expresses her dismay. In response, it's kind of interesting, Jesus says something and he does something. He says something and he does something, and both are really important. If you miss one of those two things, or you downplay one as opposed to the other, you miss the overall point of the story. So what he says is, did you not know? Did you not know I must be in my Father's house? In my Father's house, attending to my Father's business. But secondly, what he does, he goes home with them to Nazareth. He grows in wisdom and stature and the opinion of God and his people. And so both things are really important. So you put it all together, what's the takeaway message? Your primary duty, always before the Lord, is to become the person the Father is calling you to be. No one can interfere with that. Not your parents, not your parish priest, apparently not even the Blessed Virgin Mary. At the same time, he has put certain people in your path. You have certain relationships through which you're called to become that person the Father is calling you to be. And so you need to recognize both those things. Now you hold that thought and you think about the parent-child relationship. The duty which falls on kids is pretty clear. I'm called to recognize this is the nature of God's providential designs. And so I'm called to recognize, yes, there are people in my path that God has put into my path to help me learn and grow and stretch and become the person that the Father is calling me to be. And to respond to those people and those relationships with humility and obedience and docility, that type of thing. The duty which falls upon parents, though, is a little more complicated, a little more nuanced. So I'm going to spend this time today in the constant reflection talking about precisely this. What are some things that parents could know or bring to the table when it comes to raising their kids, especially when we're talking about young kids? So the first thing that comes to mind, this might sound kind of obvious, but perhaps not. It's very important to love your kids unselfishly. It's really important to love your kids unselfishly. Now, you might hear that and think, well, obviously, but let me explain it like this. When it comes to normal relationships with friends, we often bring to the table a certain expectation of reciprocity, mutual benefit. So, for example, we share in our joys, we share in our sorrows. There's a natural expectation that we bring to the table when it comes to ordinary friendship in the context of Christian community. And that's fitting. That's right and just. The point, though, is that when it comes to the parent-child relationship, it's meant to be not that. So when it comes to raising small kids especially, the expectation is that it's purely a giving love as opposed to a taking love. By way of analogy, I remember talking to my spiritual director about the priesthood, and he said to me, Eric, when you become a priest, it's really important that you don't look to the people of God to fill your emotional needs. You might like it, they might like it too. It might feel good, but it's not good. It actually gets in the way of you loving them unselfishly. Because you got to keep in mind, what's the opposite of love? The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is using another person for your own personal needs. You hold that thought, you think about the parent-child relationship. So think of it like this. It's a normal thing for spouses to argue with each other. Maybe you already knew that. To argue as opposed to being argumentative. And therein lies an important distinction. You're different. You have things you're working through in terms of commonality. You live in proximity with each other. So who are you going to argue with but your spouse, right? The invitation, therefore, is not to simply avoid arguments. The challenge is to learn how to do this well. To argue with each other in a way which is healthy, productive, and respectful. Argument as opposed to simply being argumentative. The difficulty arises, though, when we bring children into arguments we're having with our spouse. So psychologists talk about this in terms of triangulation. So two people having an argument, and you bring a third party into that same argument. And so when it comes to the parent-child relationship, this happens all the time. I start complaining about my spouse to my kids. Or I start dumping on my kids in terms of my emotional burdens, right? You got to realize it's hard enough to be a kid. It's hard enough to be a kid, especially in the modern world. Kids, they feel everything super deeply. They're wrestling with issues of identity, their emotional life, the future, the present, even the past. So it's hard enough to be a kid, never mind the added responsibility of dealing with adult issues when you're not an adult. So what you're called to do is to simply let kids be kids. To let kids be kids. And to communicate to them that that's good enough. That's precisely what you're called to do, to simply be a child, because that's reality. You're just a kid, you're not an adult. It's also really important for parents to remember that they're meant to be the primary educators of their kids. Certainly there's something to be said about Christian community, teachers and extended family, priests, youth ministry, to help you in terms of raising this child. At the same time, there's a certain power which obtains in the parent-child relationship. There's always something really unique and powerful about this idea of my mom or dad tells me this is right, this is wrong, this is true, this is false. The example that comes to mind, kids nowadays, they're not just afraid, but they're terrified all the time. And not just because of things you might expect, like grades and getting into college or a trade school or whatever. They're terrified all the time because I feel like it all depends on me to figure everything out right now. And I live in a world which has no room for mercy and no room for making mistakes. I encounter this all the time when I'm talking to kids. And I'm gonna be honest, I ask myself all the time, like, where does this come from? Maybe it comes from the culture, maybe it's a function of temperament, but I suspect a lot of times it comes from parents. Now, just to be clear about this, I don't want to lead you the way of shame, right? Here's a way for both you to grow in freedom, if you recognize the opportunity. So if you're perpetually anxious and afraid and living in tension, that doesn't just affect you, it affects your kids. On the other hand, if I grow in my relationship with Christ, and I have a certain clarity that God is Father and Savior and Redeemer, well, therefore, I have a certain clarity. It isn't all right on me. And I live in a world where there is mercy. I have room to make mistakes. I have room to grow and try new things and try again. And that's okay because God is real and He's everything the church says that He is. You are the primary educators of your children, not just in the faith, but in life. It might be kind of annoying, but your kids are watching you all the time, for better or for worse. As a result of your example, quite apart from your words, they're growing in their relationship with Christ or falling away. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind. Final thing that kind of comes to mind here. Your kids really want to talk to you. Your kids really want to talk to you. Kids really want to talk to their parents. You might feel like that's not the case, based on the recent past or whatever, but it's actually true. The example that comes to mind, oftentimes I visit the schools along with the youth minister, Ashley Mills, and recently during Advent we visited this grade 7 class, and we were talking about Advent stuff, so Christmas trees and Christmas wreaths and that sort of thing. And a lot of times when I do these school visits, I'm kind of gauging the thing in real time. What can a situation bear? If it can't bear very much, okay, I guess the whole talk was about Christmas trees. But hopefully, it can go a little bit deeper. And this was a situation where it went really deep. And so before long, we were talking about identity issues, emotional life, this sort of thing, fears and apprehensions. It was amazing. And one particular girl was so enamored with the conversation. When the recess bell went, she kind of came up to the two of us and said, can I talk to you some more? And so she talked with us all the way through recess. And again, it was one of those situations, what can the conversation bear? Quite a bit. So she would ask a question, and we would give an answer. That would provoke something in her little girl heart. She would ask another question, and she would experience this whole range of emotions in terms of the emotional palette. Before long, she was laughing and crying and smiling, and the recess bell went off. Everyone came back. They're like, "You're still here?" Yeah. And she really enjoyed it, and she felt better at the end of the conversation, and that was that. That same day, but also in days following, I was thinking about that conversation. And I was happy, obviously, that we had the opportunity to have that conversation with that little girl. She was amazing and wonderful. But I gotta admit, the whole time I was thinking, you know what? I think this little girl would really have loved to have had this conversation with her parents. She would love to have had this conversation with her mom or her dad. But for whatever reason, she felt like she couldn't. Now, I don't know her parents. I barely know her. So we can speculate, right? Why would she feel like she can't bring these things up with her parents? Maybe she was afraid, maybe she didn't feel safe, maybe she felt like her parents wouldn't be able to give a helpful response. Regardless of the reason, that's a tragedy. And the thing I want to impress upon you is that even though it's my joy and privilege to have those moments with kids, I would love it if they had those conversations with their parents all the time. Not just once a season, but all the time as a matter of course. Because you gotta realize that this little girl's heart, her little heart was not a unique situation. She recognized that the parent-child relationship is sacred ground. This is the sacred space where I'm called to grow in wisdom and stature and in opinion of God and his people, in imitation of Christ the Lord.